There is often some confusion about the two terms, so let me explain the difference. In time-lapses, the photos are taken with a static point of view, which in most cases is a camera placed on a sturdy tripod to minimize any unwanted shake. A hyperlapse is exactly the same thing, but in this case the point of view will be in motion. With a traditional ground-based camera, it is very easy to use a tripod to have a perfectly stable, fixed point of view. So most of the time we tend to shoot time-lapses. Performing a hyperlapse with a traditional camera is not simple, as we need to find a way to move the camera around. The best results are obtained with sliders, but they are bulky to carry around, and anyway only allow for a short movement and must be motorized to get a constant distance between each shot. At times we can get good results from trains, cars or buses. Another possibility is to use a handheld gimbal, but we have to cope with a good deal of other unwanted movements. Not easy. In low winds, drones can be very stable while advancing forward or sideways, and this makes them perfectly suitable for hyperlapses, like huge sliders in the sky. For this reason, with drones, people generally tend to go for hyperlapses. Like video in general, time-lapses and hyperlapses need a scene with some sort of movement. Otherwise, a simple photo, maybe animated, is more interesting. They are both very interesting techniques, but each of them is best suited for some specific situations. Hyperlapses are excellent to add movement to an otherwise static scene, or else to give an idea of frantic urban life, of excitement or confusion. But when a scene already contains some sort of interesting movement, time-lapses are often the best way to focus on what is happening. It may be the case of a sunset, or cloud movement, or cars in a city, boats in a river, and so on. I have done plenty of videos about hyperlapses and time-lapses of all kinds, and they tend to be very popular. Viewers constantly ask me to cover topics like sunset or sunrise time-lapses, how to post-process them, how to control motion blur, and so on. I have already covered all these topics in the past, but I thought it would be useful to make a comprehensive guide to everything related to time-lapses and hyperlapses. I have divided this video in chapters, so you can fast forward to specific sessions. I have added links in some chapters for users who want to go deep into the specific topic. In time-lapses or hyperlapses, we take a series of photos at a given frequency. These photos are then assembled in a video timeline. The frequency in video is generally either 24 or 25 or 30 frames per second. First of all, we need to choose the number of photos we need, based on the desired length of the time-lapse. I often need a length between 10 and 15 seconds, unless I'm shooting sunset or sunrises in Northern Europe or Canada, in which case I prefer 20 to 30 seconds. If we take 300 photos and insert them into a 30 frame per second timeline, the time-lapse will play back in 10 seconds, as 300 divided by 30 equals 10. While in a timeline of 24 frames per second, we will get about 12.5 seconds. This length is perfectly fine for our purposes. Another reason why I like to use 300 photo is because it makes it very easy to compute the shooting time. At the frequency of 1 shot per second, it will take 300 seconds, which, divided by 60 seconds per minute, equals 5 minutes. Therefore, at the frequency of a shot every 2 seconds, it will take 10 minutes, at a shot every 3 seconds, 15 minutes, and so on. Another important item to plan according to the scene and the result we want to achieve is the frequency of shots. The longer the time between each shot, the faster will be the movement in the resulting time-lapse. In hyperlapses where the point of view moves very fast, I like to take a shot every second, although not many cameras are able to do it. In the case of cars, people or boats, I choose a frequency of 2, 3 or 4 seconds, according to the speed I want to get. In landscapes where most of the movement is in the clouds, I would use a frequency of 3 to 5 seconds. A frequency of 1 shot every 5 seconds is fine for sunset or sunrises in Southern Europe, while for sunset or sunrises in Northern Europe or Canada, 6 to 8 seconds. Finally, in the case of flowers blooming or constructions, 1 shot every few minutes or more. Time-lapses are all about movement, and movement involves motion blur, as this is the way our eyes see motion. So the correct amount of motion blur is crucial for time-lapses, a make or break factor. The standard method used in videography for correct motion blur is called the 180 degrees rule, and consists, in the case of time-lapses, in using a shutter speed of 1 second with a frequency of 1 shot every 2 seconds. A shutter speed of 1.5 seconds with a frequency of 1 shot every 3 seconds, shutter speed of 2 seconds with a frequency of a shot every 4 seconds, and so on. In all the time lapses I'm showing now, taken with a full-frame camera on a tripod, I have used this rule. As you can see, the result is perfectly smooth and mimic what our eyes would see at that speed. Motion blur is the one factor that makes or breaks a time-lapse or hyperlapse. Of course, in order to get such a long shutter speed, we need ND filters. ND filters are basically sunglasses for the lens. They reduce the amount of light so that we can use a specific shutter speed regardless of the amount of light hitting the sensor. As we've seen before, we need to use very precise speeds to get the correct amount of motion blur. Therefore, ND filters are crucial for time-lapses on most occasions. Let's see now what happens if we don't use ND filters and we have to resort to much faster shutter speed. Ouch! The result is extremely jumpy and stuttering, unwatchable. It hurts my eyes. This is because there is practically no motion blur. For time-lapses and hyperlapses, we want filters with a much higher value to obtain very slow shutter speeds. In the case of cameras with variable aperture, a single filter is often enough, probably a ND128 or ND256. But several models of drones have lenses with a fixed aperture, in which case a set of several filters is needed, with values ranging from ND68 to ND1000. In a comment below you will find links to the filter I use with different drones. When shooting hyperlapses or time-lapses with drones, there are some specific factors to consider. In many models, the minimum frequency of shot is one photo every 3 seconds, especially when using the long shutter speed needed, as the camera needs some time to buffer each shot. But this is not a serious issue, as this frequency is good enough for many situations. A more important limiting factor is battery life. Since I believe that the minimum useful length for a hyperlapse is around 12 seconds, at the frequency of one shot every 3 seconds, 15 minutes of shooting time are needed. Most drones have a battery life of around 30 minutes or less, so considering the time for setting up the shots and for a safe return home, in most cases we will shoot hyperlapses of 300 photos with a frequency of one shot every 3 seconds. Mavic 3 has a much longer battery life of over 40 minutes, and with the Mini 3 Pro there is the possibility to purchase a special battery of a similar length. The extended battery life opens up extra possibilities for hyperlapses. I can at times use a longer frequency of one photo every 4 or 5 seconds, mostly when the movement comes from the clouds, or I can shoot longer hyperlapses, especially useful for day-to-night transitions. As we saw earlier, when using a frequency of one shot every 3 seconds, the ideal shutter speed is 1.5 seconds, and even slower shutter speed are needed with a longer frequency. With most drones, I would not use a shutter speed longer than 1 second, to avoid unwanted blur due to camera shake, as a drone is not as stable as a camera on a tripod. So we lose a bit of motion blur, but the results are still good. A frequent issue in drone hyperlapses is warping. Due to the very large focal length of the lens, there is a noticeable amount of distortion in each individual photo. If the aircraft drifts during the shots, may be because of wind, after stabilizing the hyperlapse, the element in the foreground appeared to move independently from the background. But this was much more evident with previous models, as the one in the latest DJI lineup tend to be more stable in flight. There are 2 ways for minimizing the issue of warping. If you notice your drone drifting more than usual, perform the different calibration needed, especially the IMU. It is also better to avoid having elements in the close foreground. But apart from these limitations, drones are sensational tools for hyperlapses. The point of view up in the sky opens up new territories for creativity. Also, they are able to perform all sorts of moves in all directions with enough stability for smooth hyperlapses. Most models on the core DJI prosumer line have several modes for hyperlapses, including the excellent waypoints. If you want to go deeper in drone hyperlapses, I have prepared a playlist with my most useful videos, including hyperlapses with specific DJI models and other techniques, like drone hyperlapses at night or how to use waypoint mode. You can click on this link to access them. Day-to-night or night-to-day transitions are probably the most spectacular subject for time-lapses, but they are certainly not the easiest. There are several different possible techniques, using fixed settings or ramping exposure. They also involve serious post-processing. This topic is too long to be covered in this video, but if you are interested, I have already a playlist with several videos about the different techniques, both with ground-based camera and with drones. You can click on this link to access them. There are 2 different stages when editing time-lapses or hyperlapses. First, we edit the individual raw files using a raw processor software. I use On1 Photo Raw, which is also capable of putting a time-lapse together, which is handy. You will find info about this program together with a coupon code in the description below. In this stage we will do static adjustments, very much like color correcting and color grading a single photo. But in most cases there will be some differences in luminosity during the time-lapse, so we want to choose one of the brightest images to make sure that we keep the highlights under control. This drone hyperlapse starts with the camera pointing down towards the village, and progressively the view shifts towards Mount Etna, with the final images containing the sky. We want to edit one of the last photos, as they are the brightest. I double-click on the image to select it. From the histogram, we can see that the photo is a bit overexposed, as there are bars touching the right edge. I often like to add a bit of the haze to improve the structure of the sky. But in time lapses we should not go too far, as it can cause very bad color shifts. Then I lower considerably the shadows, and as you can see, this increases the contrast. But this image needs even more contrast, so I add it with a dedicated slider. It is still a bit overexposed, so I lower the exposure just a touch, and add a tiny bit of midtones instead. Finally, I lower back the black point, and now the image looks very well balanced to me. The temperature is quite a bit on the warm side, so I push the temperature toward the left. Much better now. Finally, I add just a bit of saturation, and it looks very good now to me. I tap on G to go back to the grid view, press the Ctrl or Command plus A to select all the images, and I can click on this button Sync to paste all the edit to all the other images. Since we edited one of the brightest images, there might be some other at the beginning a bit too dark, but if it is the case, we will take care of it in the second stage of post-processing. Now, with all the 300 images selected, we can click on the icon Time, and the time lapse will be created. We can now import it into our video editor for the second stage of post-processing. Here is where we stabilize the footage, apply dynamic editing, and if needed, we add masks or special effects. I'm using Premiere Pro, but the workflow is practically the same with any major video editor. I start by importing the clip into the timeline. As you can see, there is a bit of wobbling in the footage. This is normal in drone hyperlapses. Actually, this one was made with a Mini 3 Pro and is remarkably stable. Stabilizing is always needed, so in the Effect tab I type Warp, and this icon Warp Stabilizer appears. I drag it over the clip, and analyzing starts. After less than a minute, the stabilizing is done, and now the footage is perfectly smooth. The clip certainly could do with more elements in motion, but otherwise it looks very good to me. But for our purposes, let's say that we would like to increase the luminosity in the last few seconds, when Mount Etna appears. We can make all sorts of dynamic adjustments by using keyframes. Let's see how they work. Let's start by adding an adjustment layer above the clip. It is not strictly needed, but it will be useful to easily confront before and after. With adjustment layer highlighted, we go to the Lumetri Color tab and increase exposure by 1 stop, which is probably more than needed, but it will make the effect more evident. Now the first part of the clip is way too bright, so we bring the playhead to the end of the clip, and in the top left window we select the tab Effect Control. We open the menu Basic Corrections, and in exposure we tap on the clock icon to set a keyframe, indicating that at that point the exposure will be +1 stop. We then move backwards on the clip until the point where we want the increase in luminosity to start. Let's say here, and we enter 0 for exposure. By watching the clip we notice that the luminosity is the same until our first keyframe, and then progressively increases until the end. If we want the increase to start a bit earlier, we can drag the first keyframe slightly to the left. For our purposes, let's double the value of exposure of the last keyframe, so that now the increase in luminosity is much more evident. Maybe we want a warmer white balance in the last part of Mount Etna. We can set 2 more keyframes at the same points as the previous one, but this time for temperature. The first one will be unchanged, while in the second one we increase the value by a good amount. But the effect of increased exposure and temperature affects the whole image, including the village, This is not what we want. Our idea was just to modify the aspect on Mount Etna. We can achieve what we want by using a mask applied to the adjustment layer. With the adjustment layer selected, we move to the last frame, and in the top left window, we click on the rectangle below Lumetri Color. A rectangle appears on the screen. Notice that the effect of the modified luminosity and temperature now is active only in the area inside the rectangle. By dragging the four corners of the rectangle, we can modify the shape, so that it will cover the upper part of the mountain. The transition is obviously too abrupt, so we increase the value of the mask feather until we get a smooth one. By using keyframe and the mask, the increased luminosity and the warmer white balance are now applied only to the top of Mount Etna.